All right, I'm in the house.
Okay, what do you see?
Nothing yet. Hold on. I think I just heard something. I'm heading upstairs.
Okay, I am almost there.
I'm in the bedroom.
Okay.
Oh, shit. It's not here.
What?
The gun's not here.
What do you mean? Where is it?
Cameron? Are you in there? Open the door. Cam! Come on, Cameron!
Hi, everyone. I'm Kris Brown and the president of Brady. And the clip that you just saw was one of the public service announcements that we developed for the End Family Fire campaign alongside our partners at the Ad Council. This new effort is dedicated to raising awareness of how safe gun storage decreases the risk of gun suicide and encourages gun owners to keep their firearms secured, giving loved ones a second chance at life. I've watched this PSA countless times, and each time I get chills and think about myself in that situation, looking for my Cameron. As a mother of 2 teenage girls, this really drives home for me. Some of you joining us this afternoon may find this hard to watch or may have strong emotions after viewing. We wanted you to think about and see Cameron and their loved ones as your own. You are there in that moment, running through your house, looking for your mom, your brother, your partner, or friend. That's intentional. Guided by hundreds of hours of market research, conversations with mental health experts, gun owners, and everyday advocates. It is why we are so grateful to be joined by a number of our partners here today to share with you all the launch of the suicide prevention phase of Brady's End Family Fire campaign. End Family Fire didn't just begin today. We launched the first round of the End Family Fire initiative in August of 2018, focusing on preventing the unintentional shootings that result from improperly stored guns in the home. End Family Fire is a social norm change campaign, much like the Designated Driver Initiative to prevent drunk driving. Our campaign will continue to bring attention and awareness to how these unintentional shootings can be averted as we work to prevent gun suicide through safe gun storage as well. Our first iteration of End Family Fire affirmed to us that it is possible to change the attitudes and behaviors of gun owners through compelling messaging that speaks directly with all communities. Just for some highlights of 2 years in on that campaign awareness among gun owners has increased substantially since it was first launched. As of September 2020, campaign awareness among gun owners reached 44%, compared to 22% when the campaign began in 2018. 43% of gun-owning parents who saw an End Family Fire ad then felt concerned that the presence of a gun in their home heightened the risk of unintentional injury or death, compared to just 16% of gun-owning parents who reported not seeing an ad. So that's a material difference, material increase in being concerned about guns in the home, loaded and unsecured guns in the home. And most importantly, 45% of gun-owning parents who saw an End Family Fire ad reported that they talked to their family and friends about safe gun storage in the last 12 months, compared to just 23% of gun-owning parents who reported not seeing the ad. It is these conversations that save lives. We're quite proud, obviously, to share these top statistics with you and look forward to sharing more as the weeks, months, and years progress. We wanted our new messaging focusing on gun suicides to similarly resonate with gun owners and motivate them to act. It's why we continued to conduct extensive market research, surveying and speaking with gun owners in areas that experience high rates of gun suicide. In partnership with the Ad Council, we also worked with some of the nation's top mental health experts and experts from disproportionately impacted groups throughout this process, seeking their input in developing the strategy and in assessing the creative ideas. We can take the first steps to end family fire together here today by going to endfamilyfire.org, following End Family Fire on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and committing yourself to sharing End Family Fire with your friends and family in the links posted in the comments section. And now it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to introduce our speakers on today's panel, nearly all of whom were by our side from the very beginning. We are glad to be joined today by Debbie Plotnick, Vice President for State and Federal Advocacy from Mental Health America, Dr. Joe Sakran of This Is Our Lane and the Director of Emergency General Surgery at Johns Hopkins Medical Center, Marquis Barefield, Assistant National Legislative Director for Disabled American Veterans, Thompson, Vice President of Community Partnerships for the Cohen Veterans Network, and Eric Mankowski, a psychologist and professor at Portland State University, who served on the APA's, the American Psychological Association's task force on the prediction and prevention of gun violence. And of course, welcome to all of you who are participating today. Let's get started. The first question I'd like to ask, and I'd ask any of the panelists participating to answer, can you first explain how family fire injuries and deaths, particularly from suicide, have impacted your work and the communities that you work with? Joe, Dr. Sakran, let's start with you. You led before we joined everyone today with actually a story from your recent experience in the trauma unit.
Thanks so much, Kris, for having me. It's great to be part of this incredible panel. Look, I come to this conversation both as someone that has survived gun violence, but also now as a trauma surgeon taking care of patients that come into our level 1 trauma center day in and day out. And when we talk about what's happening as it relates to suicide, as it relates to unintentional injury, these are things that are often, I would say, not front and center in the top of our mind. Why is that? Why do I say that as a healthcare worker? Well, the first is that suicide by a firearm-related injury is often fatal. And we as clinicians often never see those patients because they actually go to the morgue, right? Over 90% fatality rate. The other piece is the fact that there is often a lack of focus on some of these injuries, and people are often focused on either the mass shootings or some of the other aspects of gun violence that we see in this country. But the reality is that mass shootings comprise a minority of the gun violence deaths that we are seeing. And so what I have tried to do as a clinician, as someone that takes care of these patients, is to try to really talk about the issue comprehensively to ensure that people understand that there are multiple facets that comprise gun violence, injury, and death, and a significant proportion of that is death by suicide. And then the last thing that I'll just say, because I'd love to hear from the other panelists, is that we are seeing unintentional injuries all across this country. There are 4.6 million children that live in homes with unlocked and loaded weapon. And just this morning in Baltimore, and this is something that you can find, it's already been reported in the news, a 3-year-old shot himself in his home. So just, think about that for a second and think about the fact that this is not something that randomly happens. This happens every day in our country, in communities all across this nation. And the reality is this is preventable. And we're gonna, I'm sure, talk more about that here shortly.
Thank you so much, Joe. Absolutely. Caitlin, I saw you nodding your head. Can you share some of your perspective around this?
Absolutely, and I'm just going to take what Joe said at the very end and just go with that. We do know that suicide is preventable. We know this through our research, through our own personal experiences. And one of the things that we know most about how to prevent suicide is lowering that access point to the means. So reducing that time and that space between when somebody is feeling suicidal to the point that they pick up their gun or their pills, reducing that is going to say it has, and it does save lives. So by talking, and it's especially important during a crisis. And with this, we're talking about removing the access. So using the gun locks, using the gun storage, removing the ammunition, everything that you're talking about in your campaign is absolutely essential, because we know that of all of the things that we have tried to do to intervene and to prevent suicide, it's this type of work that is actually going to make a difference.
That is so absolutely spot on. And I wonder, Mr. Barefield, if you want to talk about your perspective representing disabled American veterans with respect to this question, following Caitlin.
Yes. First, let me say thank you for inviting me and DAV to be a part of this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my information, not only with the panel, but with everyone that's viewing today. Yes, we represent a population of veterans that have service-connected disabilities. And a lot of these veterans are gun owners. And a lot of them do have mental health disabilities, mental health challenges, and some have either tried to attempt suicide or have thought about attempting suicide. So for us, we are fully in support of lethal means safety training, making sure that people understand that there are ways to get help in a crisis, especially with veterans. The VA has a crisis line number that's out there that they can use and call and be able to push the number one once they make that call to the crisis line and get connected to a counselor and be able to have someone that they can talk to through whatever that situation may be. Our membership for DAV is a vast mix of young and older veterans. And the statistics have shown us that 18 to 34-year-olds are committing suicide at a very high rate. And then our older veteran population, those that are 55 years old and older, are also committing suicide at a very high rate. So this information and this campaign is very, very vital.
Thank you so much. Eric, how has the issue of family fire injuries and deaths impacted or really structured your work and the communities that you work with? You have to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today, Kris, and all of you. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. And what really brings me here today is a concern around domestic violence and how that is connected to many instances of suicide. We know from the data that both domestic violence, mass shootings, and many of the other forms, apparently other forms of gun violence, do also intersect with suicide. So recent research tells us that the majority of mass shootings, for example, include a domestic violence aspect, and that many of those domestic violence incidents involve suicide as well. So we need to understand the connection between these different kinds of violence. The other contribution that I would make here is that we've spoken thus far about people's age and about individuals and their situations being related to suicidality. And it's important, I think, to add that suicide is particularly prevalent in men and boys, and that these aren't only individuals or veterans or people, or elderly, but men in all of these groups that have been taught certain things about what it means to be man and how to ask or not ask, or whether to ask for help. And so part of my work and what brings me here today is to try to understand how we can be reaching boys and men as compassionately and supportively as possible through the challenges that they face as men trying to learn their pathways in the world.
That's so important. And obviously thinking about the various types of individuals and populations that are particularly acutely impacted is so very important to the success of this work and really at the essence of this messaging campaign. And Debbie, I wonder if you could comment on this question about Family Fire and how you have worked within Mental Health America and the communities you serve related to this issue, and maybe build in a little bit in the response, what messages seem to resonate best in talking about this issue and how Family Fire can be a useful tool, a helpful tool in these kinds of conversations.
Thank you, Kris. It's my pleasure to be here and to be working with the Brady campaign. And one of the things I want to begin with is that I work with folks on, if you will, all sides of the issues around firearms. I work with the Brady campaign and other organizations to end gun violence. I also work with firearm owning communities. And Mental Health America is absolutely neutral. We call ourselves Switzerland when it comes to issues of gun control. And that's personally how I feel too. But I want to start with my personal feelings. Right now, actually, was the first time I had the opportunity to watch this PSA, although I have seen the other ones, and it touched me very deeply. It took me back quite a few years to when I had a suicidal teen. And while there was more than one suicide attempt, it took me right back to the day when I saw myself as the cop from the cop show breaking down her door, and I did. And I remember at the end of that day thinking, I'm very glad that we don't have a firearm in our house, again, without judgment. And one of the things, as I have spent my years in mental health policy, I have learned is that most people who live through a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. But when a firearm is involved, as Joe said, then in fact, 90% of people do die, and at best they're gravely disabled if the gun in fact fires. So that's something very important to talk about, and it's very important to talk about what Eric talked about with respect to gender. Young people, particularly young females, do have more suicide attempts, but they are less lethal than boys and men because they tend not to use firearms, and that is changing. But one thing I want to talk about right now in the time of COVID is what we are seeing at Mental Health America. We have a screening site that we've been running for 5 years, and over the course of 5 years, about 5 million people come voluntarily, free, anonymous screens. Most popular screens are depression and anxiety. We have 9 screens total. What we have seen in the time of COVID is an explosion of people who come. Through all the 5 years that we've had, almost 6 years now, of our screening website, the breakdown for age and gender has been 2/3 of folks are under age 24, 75% are female. But what really was mind-blowing to us was that fully 1/3 of them were between 11 and 17. So we know that young people themselves know when something is bothering them. They're reaching out to identify it, whether or not they reach out for help right away. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. And as part of our screening program, we have been asking since the advent of COVID. Just last month, we had over 300,000 people come to our screening site. That is just unbelievable. And most folks who are screening in the moderate to severe range for mostly depression and anxiety. Psychosis screenings are also up, but all across the board we're up. And again, that demographic holds true, 1/3, 11 to 17. So we are extraordinarily concerned when it comes to firearms because we know that suicide is the number 2 leading cause of death for young people across the country. And in the area that I live in Colorado, in the Mountain West, they call it the suicide belt. So we have large numbers of suicides of folks who are in Marquis demographic, the veterans, the older people who own firearms. But it's the #1 cause of death for kids. And that's because most households do in fact have firearms in the household. And the young people that die by suicide, almost always that firearm belonged to mom, dad, grandmom, grandpop, or another member of the household.
Debbie, thank you so much for sharing your personal reaction to the video and hearing your reaction as a mom. I just, my heart goes out to you and to so many who find themselves in this situation. And thank goodness there was not a gun. And ultimately, I think that's the point that we're talking about here. If there was, having that gun safely stored, unloaded, locked, with ammunition separately could be the difference between life and death. And I just want to turn it to Caitlin and then to Marquis, especially around the issue. Debbie talked a lot about the fact that we are seeing this increase in young people who are at risk. With the backdrop of COVID, we have seen between February and this time, around this month this year, millions, literally millions more guns sold than at the same time last year. It's called the panic purchase phenomena. And many of those guns, we speculate, we don't know, but are very unlikely to be safely stored. These are purchases because of COVID that are very, very quick purchases. There's not a lot of discussion around safe storage. Many of these, from the reports we've seen, are new gun owners. Having done the research and certainly learned from Caitlin all that you have provided us during this time, we know that many veterans know their way very well around guns. They're not, you know, there's a big difference between new gun purchasers and veterans. How have you found at the Cohen's Veteran Network the right messages to talk, though, about issues of suicide within your network? And what are messages that resonate really well, and maybe some myths that those messages need to bust in order to be successful?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I also want to talk just very briefly about gender in terms of veterans, because it's a little bit different. We do know that women veterans are dying at higher rates of suicide currently, and they use guns more frequently. So look at that correlation. Similarly, male veterans die by suicide far more than male non-veterans. So it is that firearm that's the real linchpin there to what the huge issue is. So at Cohen Veterans Network, which is a network of mental health clinics throughout the country for veterans and their family members, we are very, very careful about talking about communication skills with our clients. So people come in and making sure that we have that right language to use. So military competence is super important for us. And we're learning that the language around firearms is so important to us too. As a clinician, I can speak all day with a client and talk about access, lethal means, firearms, but I am still learning about the types of firearms, especially that veterans have, to be able to use that language so that I'm not then asking, well, explain that to me, trying to have the veteran or the client educate me about something that I should already know, because we need to get beyond what kind of firearm it is. We need to get beyond what kind of gun lock it is. And so I think that communication is so important. And again, it's one thing that I really appreciate about your website, the End Family Fire website, is that it is concrete. You show what the types of gun locks are, you show photos, because it isn't just the veterans too who need to feel comfortable with this language. It's also especially the family members. And so, as Mr. Barefield can speak so much better than I can, but if you're in the military, your family is in the military. This is a cultural, your whole family is in the military. That said, the rest of your family isn't going to shooting practice, target practice, learning about how to remove ammunition from a firearm. So for your campaign and for all of us to really learn those very, very basic skills and that basic language, I think is a real game changer.
Marquis, maybe you can follow that up, following Caitlin's points, and give us your thoughts on messages for your members that resonate best around this issue.
Yes, of course. To piggyback off Caitlin's comments, when it comes down to the messages that our organization provides, it indicates that, we support, like I said earlier, lethal means safety, safe gun storage. And we know that it's still a controversial issue for some veterans and for certain members of Congress, because when you get a veteran in an environment where he's talking to his physician, or he's talking to, a psychologist or psychiatrist, there has to be a way to have the conversation to where it can be understood. Look, I'm not here to take your guns from you. I'm here to make sure that your guns are being safely stored, or that your guns are being placed in a manner in which, if for whatever reason you may have had the idea to think about doing or committing suicide, it's going to give you some pause, because it's going to take you a little while to get to that gun or get to the ammunition, and that they're not stored in the same place. So those are things that are very important to us. And then our national commander, who is an active duty reservist, is a Prevents ambassador. And I'm pretty sure you're aware of what the Prevents initiative is from the White House, their campaign to prevent suicide as well. So he speaks highly of gun safety and suicide prevention methods as well. And of course, when it comes down to people who have guns in their home, you have to have the conversation about storing them safely and making sure that, the guns are stored here, ammunition is stored there, and if at all possible, making sure that you have, the appropriate gun locks or a gun safe that is properly secured.
Absolutely. Which is exactly, obviously, the point of this entire campaign, is to really, as Caitlin noted, we're trying to get very particular about what these things really mean in terms of safe storage. Your comments, together with those that have been made by all of you, lead me to just ask a more particular question of Eric and then Joe, which is, one of the things that we realized and recognized a few years ago when we looked at starting this campaign is we have a myth associated with suicide in this country that is very unproductive, very unhelpful, and likely contributes to death and injury in this country, which is that someone intent on completing a suicide will do so that means somehow don't matter. And that's actually absolutely untrue. We know that. And that is something, though, that persists in various pockets, in various places. I run into it quite a bit where I live. And I'm wondering, Eric, what you think about that and what messages are so important to really tackle that myth and find a way in to talk about this issue with folks. And then I want to turn it over to the other panelists to also answer that.
Thank you, Kris. I think that one of the key messages comes out of things that Marquis and Caitlin and others have talked about already, thinking about guns as a public health issue. From that perspective, we can start to understand firearm storage and safety in the manner similar to other products that we have. I know Brady has made a significant inroads in this direction, where we might begin to think about firearms much like automobiles or household cleaning products that can potentially be harmful or even toxic, and that we have ways of now currently storing those that people widely practice and understand that regulate or manage how they are existing within the home. And so if we can begin to think about firearms as a similar kind of product, that really, I think, has shifted the awareness and perspective of many who might be inclined to feel that these regulations are coming after your gun. It's really much like other household products that we commonly respect because of their power. We treat them in certain manners and have certain protocols around them. So that's a messaging and framing that I think has been very powerful in the communities that I've worked with around how to address suicide through storage safety.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. And I guess, Joe, not to make you representational for the entire medical profession, but I will ask you, how do you think that medical professionals who are interacting with patients and family members who could be at risk, how would you say they're going about these kinds of conversations now? And is the term family fire in this campaign a useful tool for medical professionals in conversations with patients?
Yeah, so let me just first build off a little bit on what Eric was saying, because I think it's related, which is I do think we have to look at this from a public health perspective. And part of it is, as Eric was alluding to in some of the examples he gave, is not, we know it's not cost effective to simply focus on human behavior. We have to actually build a system where it makes it less likely for individuals to be injured. And so as we think about that and how that relates to your question, Kris, a lot of us, like when we're seeing as a healthcare worker, I mean, I'm not a pediatrician, right? I see adults, but a lot of them have kids. And often, you'll hear, well, I've taught them not to play with, the firearm. Well, we know that is like not a super effective way to prevent these injuries from happening. And so I think part of it is really kind of laying it out and being comfortable in having those conversations. I think that what Brady has done with kind of really codifying this like term of family fire is so critical, because we have to start using all kind of the same language and really kind of just, I think, drill this into Americans all across this country, similar to what was done with, Mothers Against Drunk Driving and so many other examples. I'll say one of the things that I've noticed also in healthcare that is so critical is that there is among healthcare workers, I think not everyone is comfortable enough to talk about this issue as clinicians. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. Some, didn't grow up with firearms, right? And so they're like, well, what do I know about it? How can I talk about it? Some may relate to kind of sociogeographic differences in culture. And so, as you know, we've been working together to try to figure out how do we elevate the knowledge of healthcare workers, not just doctors, but nurses and all sorts of clinicians, to provide them with kind of a baseline level of knowledge so they can actually have these conversations in objective ways. And the final thing I'll just say, and I think Debbie kind of alluded to this in the beginning when we were getting to know each other, is the commonality that exists among us as Americans. We have a lot more in common than we have that divides us. And when you talk to responsible gun owners, they want the same things that we want. No one wants to see kids being shot and killed or injured. And so really, it's a matter of trying to have these conversations in a way that's not judgmental, but simply about prevention and public health.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joe. Debbie, do you want to talk about your view around this and Mental Health America in terms of how we actually really talk and frame the issue and the importance of that to actually really addressing the issue of suicide?
Thank you, Kris. I want to frame the answer by talking about the fact that suicide, even for folks who have been thinking about it, the actual act of suicide is impulsive. It happens within 5 minutes of the intent to the attempt. Not that we've been thinking about it. In fact, I want to go back to our screening for 1 minute before I finish this, is that in our screening sites, we've seen exponential growth in numbers of people who are coming. And a couple of months ago, we started asking people about thoughts of self-harm or thoughts of dying by suicide. For most folks, overall, it's 22%. for that 11, 17%, it's 50% of days as opposed to 22% of days in a month that they think about it. So they're thinking about it. That doesn't mean they're going to act on it. But when the initiative to act on it happens, if the means, and the means matter, if there is a lethal means available, then the suicide is more likely to result in death, the suicide attempt, as opposed to just about any other way. Now, that said, it's so important that we talk to each other. And over the last 3 years, I have been working with the gun violence prevention groups and with the 2A community. And one of the reasons we came together is that we make it a point to talk to each other and not about each other. And that's really the thing that moves the non-judgmental. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear about you're a veteran, you're a police officer, firearms are important to your job. Or if you're a soldier, or they're important to your lifestyle. I moved to Colorado a few years ago. Everybody here has a gun. I had a bear in my house and the Rangers came out. The first thing they said to me was asking about my gun. So, this is something that this is the where we are and things that are important to people. And if we approach it from this public safety, and I don't mean criminalizing, I mean public health safety in our families, that matters. The other thing is that we have to encourage people to not be afraid to reach out for help. It's really important. And that's part of the work that I do with the gun owning communities and with the veteran groups, is to say, look, if you're not feeling okay, take a screen, take it, then look at it, and then here are some things you can do. Starting with I've done trainings for gun shops and worked with other organizations. Some gun shops will hold guns for you. In many states, you can give them to a family member or a friend. Some states you can't. So it's important to know state laws. And it's also important to, as your campaign makes clear, have firearms safely stored in the home with the ammunition separate. And my partners that I work with in the firearm owning community have talked a lot about how quickly you can undo a safe, or if you need to have, there are special safes that if you yourself are feeling suicidal, that you can set a timer for X number of days before your safe will unlock. These are even self-care things that are extremely important, but we want everybody to not be afraid to reach out for help when they need it and to do all the preventative things. And I don't mean to infantilize people with what I'm about to say, but I love the concept of thinking about it in the way we think about safety. We think about baby gates and latches on drawers and car seats and things like that. We're not talking about just babies, but we have no problem using those things and just making sure that in a situation where that extra safety is needed, it's there.
That's so critically important. And obviously, some of that, when we launched End Family Fire, this campaign, one of the things that we were thinking of was a household with a gun, and understanding that one of the things that you have to do if you have a gun in the home is really assess the risk over the lifetime of that household. The people who live in the household, the people who visit the household, and that's really important. And your analysis of what is necessary to address that risk may change over time. And that's really needs to happen. That's very, very important. And one of those things that may be part of that is also remote storage as an option. If someone is truly in crisis, clearly that's the safest thing to do if that's possible. And I wonder, Caitlin, your thoughts on that, and also really the broader question of messaging and understanding how we talk about this issue and debunking some of these myths that are persistent.
Yeah, and I so appreciate what Debbie was saying in terms of reaching out and talking with each other and not being scared of that. Frequently still, there's a myth that if I ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal, I'm going to put it in their head. They clearly have never thought of this before. I'm going to put it in their head. They're going to kill themselves using a gun, and it's going to be my fault. And there's actually been research that has been done that shows it's exactly the opposite effect. What you're doing when you ask somebody and you say to them in that non-judgmental, empathic way, I am so worried about you, and I'm really concerned about how things are going. Can you tell me, have you thought about taking your own life? Are you feeling suicidal? Getting right to the question. And what that is going to allow that person to do who's listening to you is to just know that you aren't scared to talk about what is probably one of the most painful things they've ever experienced. And you are there for them. And so to say to people, I am going to hold your hand through this. We are going to get through this together. You are not alone. That works and that helps. And I think that another piece of what people can do with the End Family Fire, with this campaign, is by educating themselves and their families. I would recommend having a family sit down and talk about a plan. We don't want to suddenly have to run out and buy some gun lock because somebody is in crisis all of a sudden. You want to have them early. You want to have that plan together. If you decide, you know what, I feel like I want to make sure that we know somebody to take a firearm to. If things get too bad, here's the person. Let's talk with that person. Get the plan together. It's because that in and of itself will also help to save lives, I believe.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I think that's really important, this concept of the family coming together and making a plan and having these conversations. Marquis, what are your thoughts around that, or just more broadly around messaging and this particular issue?
Yeah, when it comes down to it, like Caitlin said, you have to be able to have the conversation, whether it's with your physician, whether it's with members of your family, people that you trust in the community. Conversations have to be had about what to do in emergency situations. And look, I may not be, 100% with or myself one particular day, but I trust my neighbor next door where I can give him my weapons for safe storage just in case if something happens. Or making sure that I have that gun safe or a way to store my weapons where I won't be able to access them if I'm having a bad day. So those are things that we have to be able to talk about. And as Caitlin said, you cannot be afraid to have those conversations. I did want to follow up with one thing when I mentioned the crisis line number. I didn't give it. I just want to be able to give it right quick because it is an important piece of information that, especially during this COVID-19 time, not only does the VA crisis line had increased traffic, but other crisis lines for suicide prevention have also had increased numbers as well. But for veterans specifically, the VA crisis line number is 1-800-273-8255. And like I said, and specifically for veterans, you push the number 1 and they will get you connected with a counselor that you can talk to. And that information is valuable because a personal experience of my own, one of my fraternity brothers, just a few weeks ago, had an experience where he wasn't himself. A friend of mine, or another fraternity brother, who was up because he works late nights. He was up at 3 o'clock in the morning and saw a post with our other brother with a gun in his hand and made a comment, a very strange off the wall comment. And my phone rang and a few other of our brothers' phones rang. And we were able to get him onto the VA crisis line. And a conversation was held from 4 in the morning to 7 o'clock in the morning with that Veterans Crisis Line counselor and my brother who was contemplating committing suicide. So those mechanisms are there and they work if people will use them.
Can I jump in for just 1 second, Kris, on this subject?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Marquis, for bringing up the suicide prevention hotline. And the number that you gave is the general number, and pushing number 1 will get you to the veterans.
Right.
The FCC has recently approved using a 3-digit number for crisis, and it's 988. Now we have just a little bit of legislative advocacy. Yesterday was our day of action to make 988 that number, but it's not too late today to call your House numbers. And there's just a little bit of political fiddling that needs to happen between the House and the Senate. But calling your federal legislators and saying, pass 988, make it a reality, it saves lives. So thank you for letting me interject.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like you said, with the legislative action that's needed, hopefully that will be able to come into reality here. If I remember the legislation correctly, they're trying to get it pushed through as quickly as possible so it can take place by June of either 2021 or 2022. So they're trying to hurry up and get it pushed through. Instead of being able to remember that long number that I just spoke, they can just push 988 and it can do the same thing and connect them with the counselor right away.
Terrific. Thank you. We have quite a few people listening at the moment, and I just wanted to say, if there are questions, we only have a few minutes left, but please post those in the comments section. And if we can't get to them, we promise to follow up and provide answers to your questions. If you give your email address, we will make sure that that happens. If you post a question in the next couple of minutes, we'll try to get to it. And while we wait to see if any come up, I just want to ask a general question that each of you could take brief time to answer, which is, we've gotten to some of this, but really the feedback that you're giving and the details is so rich and important. If you had one piece of advice to give to the general public, to family members, to people who might be concerned about a friend or a relative, about a loved one who they think is at risk, what would that be? And let's just go around the proverbial room here. I see Joe to my left. Let's start with you, Joe, and then we'll go to Debbie, Eric, Marquis, and Caitlin.
Okay. If there was one piece of advice, it would be don't be afraid to ask, or don't be afraid to have the conversation. I mean, it's similar to what Caitlin and others have said. I think we're trying to break this like cultural barrier of like just simply talking about having a gun in the home, about, you know, how you're feeling, you know, from a mental health perspective. So I think being willing to have those conversations is so critical. That would be my one piece.
That's great. Debbie?
Thank you. I agree with Joe that we really have to have that conversation with everyone has mentioned it. It's so important to talk about it when you see that somebody might be struggling or you suspect it. And sometimes you don't, but it's important to talk about it. It's important to let people know that they really matter. Young people right now are especially struggling, and to acknowledge it's really hard. I really care about what really matters. Let's have a conversation about safety. Let's have a conversation about suicide prevention. And that goes to every member of the family. We know older people are feeling isolated and alone in different ways than young people are. But again, these same kinds of things. Conversation without judgment.
Thank you, Debbie. Eric?
I would just add and echo what others have said. I had the opportunity, unfortunately, last week to have a longtime friend under the pressure of COVID telling me about his suicidality and suicidal feelings. And what I would add to the wonderful recommendations of others around asking is what I did also, to ask, do you have a gun at home? I didn't know. Many family members don't know about their partners or other household members' guns in the home. And it's important to ask about the availability of those as well as part of that planning that Caitlin was describing.
Thank you, Eric. That's so absolutely critical, and obviously something that we want people to also look to the endfamilyfire.org website to get more information about exactly that and about safe storage. Marquis, what are your thoughts?
The message rings true, as everyone has mentioned. You cannot be afraid to have the conversation. A former neighbor of mine for many years, when he came back from deployment, all he wanted to do from time to time was just sit down and talk about some of his experiences. He was in the Navy, I was in the Army, and he just wanted to get it off his chest. And then we moved, and his wife called. We were maybe here in our house in Frederick now, maybe a year, and she indicated that, you know, he had taken his life and committed suicide. And I just remember some of the conversations that we had. And that's why I say you can't be afraid to talk to someone. You cannot be afraid to have that conversation with someone to say, hey, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Is everything okay with you and your family? So it is very important to be able to open up those channels of communication and talk to one another. It's very important.
And really reach out. Caitlin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, all of the above, and just remembering that there is hope, remembering that this is preventable, and to be able to talk to people who, when people are feeling suicidal, your perspective is a mess. You are thinking that you're worthless, that no one cares about you, that you're a burden, and it is so hard for you to have any sense of hope. So to have somebody be next to you and talk through that hopefulness, even if that person isn't necessarily feeling it at that time, you know that it just moves it forward. And so remembering as you are talking about things that there is hope. And finally, if you yourself are concerned about somebody, you yourself are not alone either. There are all of these resources available to you. There are those of us through Cohen Veterans Network, through the VA, through DAV, through all of these amazing organizations. We're here to help. And so know that you are not alone and that you shouldn't be feeling isolated if you are working and if you're concerned about somebody who may be suicidal too.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And with that, I think you have the last word collectively. And I just want to add to that not having experienced a close friend, but others in my network, extended network, who have really struggled, and some I know who've attempted suicide, some who are part of this cause who have lost people to suicide. The importance of reaching out and just starting the conversation with people who you think could be at risk can't be underestimated. And it's as simple as Marquis and others of you have said, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And opening up the dialogue is so critically important. And so I just want to say to all of you, to Joe, Debbie, Eric, Marquis, Caitlin, thank you so very much for your time. Thank you for everything that you're doing for this cause. I mean, we've assembled a real powerhouse here who are singularly devoted to saving lives in this country. And I personally want to thank you for everything that you're doing. And certainly on behalf of Brady, I want to thank you for taking your time with us today. For those of you listening, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're grateful to be sharing this new phase of End Family Fire with such great partners and organizations and with people in communities across America. I want to urge all of you with us today to take this message with you and to continue to spread awareness, not just of the End Family Fire program, but of how to prevent gun suicide. You can take the first steps to end family fire by going to endfamilyfire.org, following End Family Fire on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and committing yourself to sharing End Family Fire with your friends and your family. That's how this campaign works. It's on all of us to do that. Remember, when someone attempts suicide with a gun, they rarely get a second chance to live a full life. By storing guns in our homes securely, we can help prevent a temporary crisis from becoming a permanent tragedy. Once again, thank you all so very much, and we hope that you will have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.